The telegram arrived at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force on the morning of September 14, 1944. It wasn't addressed to Eisenhower. It wasn't addressed to Patton. It was addressed, specifically, to Omar Nelson Bradley, the bespectacled, soft-spoken son of a Missouri schoolteacher who had somehow become the man commanding more American soldiers than any general in the history of the United States Army. The message had been intercepted from German military intelligence. Its contents were brief. Its meaning was not. Adolf Hitler had placed a personal bounty on Bradley's head. Not because Bradley had humiliated the Wehrmacht on a single battlefield, but because Bradley's way of fighting, methodical, soldier-centered, built on the radical idea that the man with a rifle in his hands knew something the general with a map in his hands did not, had become an existential threat to everything the German military doctrine believed about war. Hitler didn't fear Bradley because Bradley was reckless. He feared him because Bradley was right. And somewhere in the autumn mud of the German frontier, in a place that most Americans had never heard of and couldn't pronounce, a young captain from Kansas named Roland Finch and 11 men from the 30th Infantry Division were about to prove exactly how right Bradley was, in a battle that headquarters didn't plan, couldn't control, and almost certainly would not survive. What did Omar Bradley do when Hitler put a bounty on his head? He sent men like Roland Finch to collect it. Part 1. The weight of the mission. By September 1944, the Allied advance across Europe had stalled in a way that no one at SHAEF wanted to say out loud. The breakout from Normandy, the shattering sprint across France that had looked, briefly, like the war might be over by Christmas, had run into something harder than German steel. It had run into logistics. The Allied supply chain, stretched 800 miles from the Normandy beaches, was hemorrhaging. Fuel convoys couldn't keep pace with the armor. Ammunition dumps were being rationed at the front. Patton's Third Army, the most aggressive armored force in the Western Theater, had literally run out of gas east of the Moselle River and sat, engines cold, waiting. Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group from his forward headquarters near Verdun, understood something that the optimists at SHAEF did not. The Germans were not broken. They were regrouping behind the Siegfried Line, the West Wall, a fortified belt of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, and interlocking fields of fire that ran the entire length of Germany's western border. Every day the Allies spent waiting on supplies was another day the Germans spent reinforcing positions they should have been too shattered to hold. Bradley needed penetration points. Specific, localized ruptures in the German line that could be exploited before winter made large-scale operations impossible. One such point had been identified by G2, Army Intelligence, along the Worm River Valley in the area northeast of Aachen, where the 30th Infantry Division, the Old Hickory Division, had been grinding forward since mid-September. The specific objective, a communications relay station and ammunition depot, the Germans had established in and around the village of Palenberg, approximately 3 kilometers northwest of the town of Galenkirchen. Intelligence assessed the garrison at no more than 60 Wehrmacht infantry, supported by 2 88 mm anti-tank guns positioned on the eastern ridge. A reinforced company assault, covered by artillery, could take the village in 48 hours. Captain Roland Finch, 27 years old, from Salina, Kansas, received his orders on the evening of September 17, 1944. Finch was not the kind of officer the Army made recruitment posters about. He was 5 feet 9 inches, wore wire-rimmed glasses that he'd repaired twice with electrical tape, and had a habit of reading terrain maps the way a chess player reads a board, quietly, for a long time, before saying anything at all. He'd graduated from the University of Kansas in 1939 with a degree in civil engineering, a background that Bradley's staff had noted produced exceptional tactical officers because they understood ground, slope, drainage, and the geometry of space the way infantrymen who'd never built anything simply did not. Finch commanded the 2nd Platoon of Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, 30th Infantry Division. His platoon sergeant was Staff Sergeant Darnell Okafor, 31, from Memphis, Tennessee, a man who had grown up on his uncle's farm and who could read weather, soil, and silence with the same unconscious fluency. Okafor had been wounded twice, once in Sicily and once outside St. L, and had returned to the platoon both times before his medical leave was technically complete. 2 other men would matter to what happened next. Private First Class Tomas Wirtzbicki, 19, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, the platoon's best barman, who had once kept a German counterattack suppressed for 11 minutes alone while the rest of his squad fell back to a defensible position. 11 minutes. Alone, with 1 automatic rifle. He'd used 340 rounds. And Corporal James Attaway, 22, from Birmingham, Alabama, the platoon's radioman, who slept with the Skrar 300 field radio beside him the way other men slept with photographs of their wives. The plan, as headquarters designed it, was clean. Baker Company would move northeast along the Palenberg Road at 0400 on September 19, cross the Worm at the identified ford site 300 meters south of the village, establish fire superiority on the western approach, and push through while artillery suppressed the German positions on the eastern ridge. The flaw in the plan was this: the ford site had been identified from aerial photographs taken 6 weeks earlier, in August, before a week of heavy rain had raised the Worm River by nearly 4 feet. No one at headquarters knew this. The photographs were 6 weeks old. The river was not. In the German command post at Geilenkirchen, Oberst Heinrich Kraus, 52, commander of the 183rd Volksgrenadier Regiment, received intelligence of the planned American assault on the evening of September 18. He read the report. He set it down. And he said, to his operations officer, something that would be recovered in captured documents 4 months later and would become one of the most cited examples of Wehrmacht overconfidence in the Western theater. These Americans, Kraus said, attack like clockwork and bleed like men. The clock is predictable. Let them come. Kraus was not a fool. He was a decorated officer who had survived the Eastern Front, but he had studied the American Officer Corps through the lens of 1942 and 1943, not 1944. He had watched American units at Kasserine Pass, at Anzio, at the grinding early failures in Tunisia. He had not yet encountered what Omar Bradley had spent 2 years building, a doctrine of ENCO-level initiative, terrain reading over map reading, and the systematic exploitation of everything the enemy thought was safe. The clock, Kraus believed, was always predictable. He was about to learn what happens when the clock stops working. Part 2. The Trap Springs Baker Company moved out at 03:45 on September 19, 1944, 15 minutes ahead of the planned time, because Finch had looked at the sky the night before and didn't like what the clouds were doing. If rain was coming, he wanted to be across the Worm before the ground softened further. The approach march was 4 kilometers through farmland that the autumn had turned to gray mud and dead corn. Finch moved his platoon along the tree line rather than the road, a deviation from the plan that his company commander, Captain Leonard Malone, had approved with the sort of weary acquiescence that characterized good commanders in the fourth month of continuous combat. At 0420, the platoon reached the ford site. The Worm River, in August aerial photographs, had been approximately 8 meters wide and perhaps 40 centimeters deep at the crossing point. Intelligence had estimated the ford as manageable for infantry and standard equipment. What Finch found at 0420 on September 19 was a river running dark and fast at what he estimated immediately. Correctly, as it turned out, was nearly 1.5 meters of depth. The current was strong enough to be audible in the darkness. The far bank, which the photographs had shown as a shallow slope of perhaps 15 degrees, had been undercut by the flooding and now rose as a near vertical mud wall nearly 1 meter high. Okafor appeared beside him without being summoned. "That's not fordable," Okafor said quietly. "No," Finch said. "Map shows another crossing point 800 meters north. Map also showed this one was usable." Okafor was quiet for a moment. "North crossing puts us in the open field on the approach. They'll see us." "I know." Finch radioed the situation to Malone. Malone relayed to Battalion. Battalion, working from the same 6-week-old photographs, radioed back within 4 minutes. "Proceed to alternate crossing. Artillery prep begins 0500 as scheduled. You have 40 minutes. 40 minutes. 800 meters of open ground, a river crossing of unknown viability, and whatever was waiting on the other side." "Move," Finch said. They were 300 meters from the northern crossing when the German machine guns opened up. Not from the ridge to the east, where the 88s were supposed to be. From the north. From the farmhouse on the left. From the drainage ditch along the right edge of the road that the map had shown as dry. The first burst took down Private James Hooper, 20, from Akron, Ohio, who had been walking point. He went down without a sound and did not get up. The second burst stitched across the left flank and caught Private Yusuf Amir, 23, from Dearborn, Michigan, the platoon's interpreter and one of 3 Arabic speakers in the entire regiment, in the right thigh. Amir went down screaming. The platoon broke right on instinct and training simultaneously, which is the only reason more men didn't die in those first 20 seconds. Wiersbicki was already firing, his bar hammering at the muzzle flash from the farmhouse, giving the squad something to move against. Okafor was pulling men into the ditch line on the right, shouting names in the darkness, getting a count. Finch was on the radio. "This is Baker 2 Actual. We're in contact, north of the ford. At least 2 MG positions. We have casualties. Request artillery shift. Over." The answer that came back was the kind that rewires a man's understanding of his situation in the span of a sentence. "Baker 2, this is Battalion 6. Artillery prep has been redirected. 8th Corps priority target, Geilenkirchen Rail Junction. You are on your own until 0700. Acknowledge, 90 minutes away." The farmhouse machine gun crew was German paratroopers, Fallschirmjäger, not Volksgrenadier at all. They had arrived at Palenberg on September 17, 2 days before the American assault, as part of a German reorganization that Allied intelligence had completely failed to detect. The 60 Wehrmacht infantry the G2 assessment had identified were there, but so were 40 Fallschirmjäger, crack troops with a fundamentally different combat doctrine. They had put their machine guns not on the ridge, but in the low ground, covering the approach the Americans were sure to use. The intelligence had been wrong about the ford, wrong about the garrison composition, wrong about the gun positions. Within the span of 11 minutes, the plan had ceased to exist entirely. Finch counted his men. 9 effectives, Hooper was dead. Amir was wounded and couldn't walk. Private Rutherford had taken shrapnel across his left forearm and was binding it himself, teeth clenched, working with one hand. The radio was working, but headquarters had nothing to offer. The artillery was gone. The ford was impassable. They were pinned in a drainage ditch in open farmland, 200 meters from a fortified farmhouse, with German paratroopers in front and a flooded river behind. In the German farmhouse position, Feldwebel Hans Ritter, commanding the machine gun section, sent a runner back to the Palenberg garrison with a message: "Americans have walked into the position exactly as predicted. 2 casualties confirmed. They are pinned. They cannot advance and cannot retreat. Request permission to finish them at dawn." Ritter's request was approved. In the German command post at Geilenkirchen, Oberst Kraus received the preliminary report with satisfaction. Clockwork, he had said. And here they were, stuck in a ditch, waiting for dawn. But Ritter had made one error in his assessment. He had noted that the Americans were pinned. He had not noted that their officer had stopped firing, and in the drainage ditch, in the darkest part of a cold German September morning, Roland Finch was not fighting. He was thinking. Part 3. The Bradley Principle. Omar Bradley had said it first in a training address to officers of the First Army in England in the spring of 1944, and it had been repeated so many times since that it had become something close to doctrine. The enemy's resistance is not a wall. It is information. Every place he stops you hard is a place he cannot stop you elsewhere. Not poetic, not the kind of line that gets carved in marble. But in a drainage ditch outside Palenberg at 0445 on September 19, 1944, it was the most useful sentence Roland Finch had ever heard. The German machine guns were in the farmhouse and in the north ditch. That meant they were not on the river. The Fallschirmjäger had put their strength at the approach point because that was where the Americans were supposed to be. On their feet, moving, crossing at the ford, walking into the fields. They had not prepared for Americans who didn't cross. Finch spread his map on the mud beside Okafor's shoulder and put his red-filtered flashlight on it for 4 seconds. Exactly 4 seconds, timed by count. Enough to see, not enough to be seen. If we came at this from the south, Finch said, "What are we crossing?" "Still the river." "But the bend here," Finch tapped the map. The photographs showed a damaged footbridge. Partial collapse. What does a partially collapsed bridge tell you? Okafor looked at him in the dark. That it was supporting weight recently enough to damage, not long enough to wash out. And if the German paratroopers knew about the alternate crossing to the north, they'd cover it. Which they did. Then they think the bridge is either impassable or a non-factor. Okafor was quiet for 3 seconds. Then it might be passable, if a man doesn't try to drive a truck over it. This was the Bradley Principle in action, not as a speech, but as a calculation. The obstacle was information. The machine guns pointing north were telling Finch exactly where the Germans were not watching. A bridge they considered broken was, in the enemy's tactical logic, a position that didn't need a gun on it. The problem was the farmhouse between the ditch and the bridge approach. 20 meters of open ground. At least one MG-42, possibly 2, and there were civilians in the farmhouse. Finch had spotted it in the last seconds before the ambush hit, a light, briefly visible in an upper window. Not a military light, a candle. And in the farmhouse adjacent to the one the Germans had turned into a gun position, he'd seen, in the moonlight, a bicycle leaning against a wall and 2 pairs of wooden shoes in the doorway. Dutch farmers, perhaps Belgian. This close to the German border, impossible to be certain. But someone had been living in that building as recently as hours ago. The German gun position was in the main house. The civilians, if they were there, were in the adjacent smaller structure, perhaps 10 meters to its left. Finch could request artillery. If the radio was reaching battalion, it might eventually reach someone with authority to redirect fire. A single artillery concentration on the farmhouse would silence the machine gun. It would also, with near certainty, kill whoever was in the building beside it. He didn't request artillery. What he did instead would be cited 3 months later in a 12th Army group after action analysis as a textbook application of what Bradley's staff had termed economy of force through misdirection, the principle that a small unit, properly applied against an enemy's blind spot, multiplies its effective combat power by a factor the enemy cannot calculate until it's too late. Okafor takes 4 men. They stay here, they keep firing at the farmhouse. Noise, attention, make them think we're still pinned. Where's Bicky? You're with me. We take Rutherford, despite the arm, because I need his hands on a rope, and Attaway with the radio. You're going to the bridge, Okafor said. I'm going to the bridge. 6 men. 6 men. Finch looked at his platoon sergeant for one moment. Bradley doesn't ask for perfect. He asks for movement. Part 4. The breaking point. The artillery they no longer had was supposed to be firing right now. Instead, the sound of Okafor's 4 men keeping up a steady, careful fire at the farmhouse, controlled bursts, not panic fire. Exactly the kind of sustained contact that would tell a German commander that the Americans were still pinned and still committed to the northern approach. Finch moved his 4 men south along the ditch, low, in silence. Not crawling, walking, bent double. Placing each foot with the deliberate care of a man who understands that the sound of a boot on a stone can be the last decision he ever makes. The ditch ran south for 140 meters before it petered out into open ground. They had perhaps 30 meters of exposed field to cross before the terrain dropped into the tree line that ran along the river's south bank. 30 meters, in darkness that was already beginning to gray at the eastern edge. Fast, Finch said. Together, if someone goes down, keep moving. That's an order. He looked at Wiersbicki, who was 19 years old and had already survived more than most men twice his age. Wiersbicki nodded once. They ran. The Germans at the farmhouse did not see them. Okafor's men chose that moment to increase their rate of fire, not on Finch's signal, because there was no signal, but because Darnell Okafor had been reading combat long enough to know when a distraction was needed without being told. The tree line swallowed them. The bridge was there, half of it, more precisely. The eastern span had collapsed, the wooden decking was gone, and the central support beam had cracked through at its base, leaving a gap of perhaps 2 meters over the fast dark water. The western span was intact, structurally questionable, but intact. Rutherford, right arm bound and nearly useless, worked the rope with his left hand and his teeth. He was from Birmingham, like Attaway, and he'd done enough farm work to know knots. He tied off to a tree root on the western bank, threw the line across the gap, and Finch caught it on the 3rd attempt. 2 meters over 4 feet of fast-moving water. In darkness. With a damaged crossing, they went across one at a time. Finch first, because that was the rule he'd made for himself. Officers don't send men where they haven't been. The beam held. Wierzbicki second. Attaway, with the radio, third. Rutherford last, one-armed, swearing quietly and continuously under his breath. 4 men on the eastern bank of the Worm at 0531. The ammunition depot was 200 meters northeast. The communications relay, according to intelligence, was in the stone building at the village's center, the one with the antenna array that had shown up clearly in the August photographs. What the photographs had not shown was the Fallschirmjäger billet. 16 German paratroopers were sleeping in the agricultural storage building 40 meters from the communications relay. They had pulled a double watch the night before, and their sergeant had granted them 4 hours of sleep before the anticipated mopping-up operation against the pinned Americans. They were excellent soldiers in excellent position. They were also asleep. Finch had 4 men, 60 rounds of rifle ammunition per man, 1 bar, 1 scrar, 300 radio, and an objective that headquarters had planned for a reinforced company. He stopped at the tree line east of the village and assessed for 90 seconds. The communications relay building. The storage building with the sleeping Fallschirmjäger. A village well in the open ground between them. A stone wall running east to west along the northern edge that would give covered access to within 15 meters of the relay building. And then Attaway touched his arm. "Captain." Attaway's voice was barely a sound. He pointed. A child, standing in the doorway of the easternmost house. 6, perhaps 7 years old, watching them with the absolutely still attention of a child who has learned that strangers mean danger and that silence is survival. Finch held up his hand, palm out. "Stay." The child did not move. 3 feet from the child's doorway, a German ammunition crate. Stacked outside, recently, 2 more crates beyond it. The building the child was standing in, a civilian home, was being used as an ammunition staging point. The occupants were still in it. Moving on, the relay building would pass within 10 meters of that doorway. Any firefight would put those rounds in the vicinity of that child. Finch had seconds to make a decision that no training manual had ever adequately prepared him for. The mission: destroy the communications relay and the ammunition depot. The reality: civilians in the line of fire. The tactical truth: 4 men could not take 2 objectives simultaneously. Choose one. He chose the communications relay, not the depot. The relay, once destroyed, would blind the German command at Geilenkirchen for hours, degrading their ability to coordinate any response. The ammunition depot without the relay was dangerous but manageable for following units. The relay without the depot was a victory. The depot without the relay was a problem solved too late. He moved his men along the stone wall. What happened in the next 9 minutes was described later by Staff Sergeant Okafor, who heard it on the radio, as the kind of fight that happens when someone has already decided they're not going to lose. Finch's 4 men took the communications relay building with a combination of a smoke grenade, Wierzbicki's bar at the window, and the specific advantage of attacking from the one direction, the east, that the Germans inside had not covered, because it was the direction facing the river they considered impassable. The garrison inside, 6 Fallschirmjäger, 2 communications technicians, and a lieutenant who had received his commission 6 weeks earlier. They were not cowards. They fought. But they were fighting men who were supposed to be across an impassable river, attacking from a direction that didn't exist in their defensive plan. The relay was taken. Then the storage building opened up. 16 Fallschirmjäger, woken by the firefight, came out of the storage building fast and organized, because they were professionals and professionals don't sleep fully even when they're sleeping. They took positions in 40 seconds. They identified Finch's 4 men within 90 seconds. 4 Americans, 16 Germans, in a stone building with one window facing east. This was the moment the German machine gunners had planned to call the mopping up complete. Instead, Ottaway got through to battalion on the radio. Not for artillery. There was no artillery to give. But Ottaway, 22 years old, from Birmingham, Alabama, got through to the company frequency and reached Malone. And Malone, without orders, on his own authority, violating the artillery priority directive that battalion had issued 40 minutes earlier, redirected 2 81 mm mortar teams to fire on the grid coordinates Finch gave him. The mortars fired 12 rounds. 10 landed in the field between the storage building and the communications relay, close enough to force the Fallschirmjäger back into cover. Not enough to defeat them, but enough. Okafor, hearing the contact on the radio, moved his 4 men off the farmhouse approach and south, along the route Finch had taken, across the bridge, and into the eastern village edge in 11 minutes. 11 men total now, against 14 surviving Fallschirmjäger in a stone building. Not even odds, but different odds than 4 against 16. Rutherford, one-armed, fired his last 8 rounds, and then used the rifle as a club against a doorframe, forcing a German paratrooper back long enough for Wierzbicki to get a clear shot. Wierzbicki was hit in the left shoulder in the same moment. He did not stop firing. At 0623 on September 19, 1944, the last organized German resistance in the village of Palenberg collapsed. The surviving Fallschirmjäger, 6 men, surrendered to a captain from Kansas, a sergeant from Tennessee, and 9 men who were collectively running on approximately 140 rounds of ammunition and something that cannot be measured in any after-action report. The communications relay was destroyed. The ammunition depot, which, it turned out, contained not the 60 rounds the intelligence had estimated, but nearly 400 artillery shells, was secured intact, its contents later used by the very American guns it had been meant to oppose. Oberst Krauss, at his command post in Geilenkirchen, received the news at 0641. The battle report from Palenberg read, "Communications relay destroyed. Ammunition depot captured by American infantry of unknown strength. Fallschirmjäger garrison defeated." Krauss read it 3 times. Then he wrote in his operational diary, a document captured by American forces in November 1944 and preserved in the National Archives, a single line, "I do not understand how this was possible." Part 5. The Verdict. The village of Palenberg at 0700 on September 19, 1944, smelled like smoke, wet stone, and something that every combat veteran recognizes and no one who has not been in a firefight can fully describe. The specific chemical residue of a fight that has just ended. When the ears are still ringing and the hands have not yet stopped shaking, and the mind is doing the inventory it always does after contact. Who is standing? Who is not? Hooper was dead. Amir was alive, being treated by Rutherford, who was treating him with one arm. Wierzbicki had taken a round through the left shoulder that had cracked the collarbone and missed everything vital by approximately 2 centimeters. He was conscious, furious, and trying to reload a rifle he could no longer lift without help. 11 men had gone across that broken bridge. 11 came back across it later that morning. One of them in a litter, one of them in a body bag. The child who had watched from the doorway was gone. Inside, presumably, pulled back by whoever was with him. The doorway was empty. The ammunition crates were still there. They would be catalogued by follow-on forces as part of the depot capture. The German after-action accounting, assembled from captured documents, prisoner interrogations, and the post-war testimony of surviving Fallschirmjäger officers, produced what historians of the Western European campaign have come to regard as one of the clearest articulations of the Wehrmacht's failure to adapt to Bradley's tactical philosophy. Lieutenant Werner Schaffer, the young communications officer who had been captured in the relay building, was interrogated at a holding facility near Maastricht in late September 1944. His written statement, preserved in the G2 records of the 30th Infantry Division, included the following: "We had been taught that Americans attacked in patterns, that their officers followed plans even when the plans were wrong. We were taught to find the pattern and break it at the decisive moment. But there was no pattern. There was only a man who had decided to go where we were not, and enough men who trusted him to go with him. This is not something we had prepared against." Feldwebel Ritter, who survived the battle and was taken prisoner in October 1944 during a subsequent American advance, was more direct. In a post-war interview conducted by American military historians in 1947, he said, "I sent a message that they were finished. I believed it. But I had been thinking about where they were, not about where they might decide to go. That is a different problem entirely, and I did not know the difference until it was too late." Oberst Krause's diary entry, the one that said simply, "I do not understand how this was possible," was followed 3 days later by a longer assessment in which he wrote that American small unit leadership in the autumn of 1944 had undergone a transformation that the German intelligence picture had not reflected. He attributed it, specifically, to what he called eine Philosophie der Bewegung, a philosophy of movement that had been systematically cultivated at the officer and ENCO level by American command. He did not know Bradley's name, but he was describing Bradley's doctrine precisely. Omar Bradley received the after-action report on Palenberg on September 22, 1944. He was, at that moment, managing a headquarters that controlled 4 field armies, coordinating a front that stretched from the Swiss border to the North Sea, and dealing with the political fallout from the German bounty announcement that had prompted additional security protocols his entire staff found excessive and he found annoying. He read the Palenberg report. He underlined one line, the line about the footbridge, and Finch's decision to use it. He wrote in the margin, in his precise schoolteacher's handwriting, "This is what we're building. More of this." The line is visible today. The original document is in the Omar N. Bradley Papers at the U.S. Army Military History Institute at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. Anyone can request to see it. Captain Roland Finch received the Silver Star in October 1944. The citation described, in the careful language of military decoration, a display of initiative and tactical ingenuity under extreme conditions. Finch, according to his company commander, read the citation once, folded it, and put it in his field jacket next to a letter from his younger sister in Salina, Kansas. He continued with the 120th Infantry through the Siegfried Line, through the Hürtgen Forest, through the Bulge, and across the Rhine. He was still commanding his platoon on May 8, 1945. He became a civil engineer after the war. He built roads in Kansas and Missouri for 30 years. He died in 1991. His grandson, speaking at a veterans ceremony in Salina in 2019, said that his grandfather had spoken of the war exactly twice in his life. The second time, he'd said this: "We were never fighting the Germans. We were fighting their assumptions about us. Every time you proved their assumptions wrong, that was the battle won." That is Omar Bradley's legacy, stripped to its core. Not the maps, not the medals, not the 5 stars he received in 1950. The legacy is in the drainage ditch, in the broken bridge, in the decision made in the dark by a man who had been taught that an obstacle is not a wall, it is a message, and the message tells you where to go. If your grandfather, great-grandfather, or great-uncle served with the 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, or anywhere along the Siegfried Line in the autumn of 1944, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What town did they fight through? Where did they end up? Those stories live in family memory and nowhere else. Keep them alive. There is a small stone bridge over the Worm River south of Palenberg. It has been rebuilt since 1944. But the tree roots on the western bank are old, and if you know where to look, you can still see the scarring in the bark where a rope was tied, once, in the dark, by a one-armed man from Birmingham who had a job to do. The scar is still there,